My name is Jeremy Pilgrim and I'm the Managing Director of School Property Matters. And I'd like to talk to you today about pupil capacity, the forgotten fundamental of good estates management. So, a little bit of an introduction about me. I needed to put a good picture of me up because that's what I look like when I'm allowed to get my hair cut. I've had 25 years experience of working with estates managers across the country on the pupil capacity of their schools. I've worked with schools, trusts, local authorities, and I think to date I've worked with 2,500 schools and done over 4,000 surveys with many schools that we've worked with for many years. I've always been very passionate about property data in schools and making sure that schools have a good set of base data that is well structured, that they can work on to plan their estates and get their strategic estate management correct. So what I'd like to talk to you today about is a little bit about the background on pupil capacity, what it is and where it fits in, how it's worked out today, so who's responsible for it, and where we feel as a company it should be in the future and how it should be managed in the future. So to begin with, the background. So if we go a very long way back to 1997, we had a new man in 10 Downing Street, Tony Blair, and David Blunkett, his education secretary, who set out with a vision to spend a lot more money on the school estate to get the school buildings in this country up to a good standard. And their way of working was to create what they called asset management planning on the three pillars of condition, sufficiency and suitability. So in simple terms, I have a space in the school. Is it in good enough condition to teach the children? Is it suitable to teach the children, and is it sufficient? So sufficient being, in that case, we needed 56 square metres to teach 30 children in a general teaching classroom. So if my space was 56 square metres and it was a general teaching classroom, it was sufficient. But if it was 56 metres long and 1 metre wide, then it was the correct area, but it wasn't suitable for teaching. So the suitability looked at the environmental factors around that space and was it what was needed to teach in. And they introduced these standards for all schools across the country as a base measure for property data. If we move forward to 2013, there was a new funding stream of Basic Need came online, and the intention of Basic Need was to generate enough pupil places for the boom in the birth rate that had gone on over the previous 10 years. So there was a massive increase in the number of pupils. I think about 600,000 pupils needed a school place, and Basic Need funding was the money that was allocated to that. So what is pupil capacity? Well, it's basically figuring out, we have a school building and how many pupils can we fit into that. So the way we look at pupil capacity is we take the school out of the buildings. So the operational unit of the teachers, pupils and teaching materials, we put them on one side and we look at the school buildings in isolation to figure out how many pupils can that school accommodate. And we do that by looking at the area data. So what's the size of each space? And that means each space. So this is down to corridors, stores, halls, dining rooms, offices, and all of the teaching spaces. And then we need to define the usage of the space. So we have our own definitions that we use on site to define what goes on within each space. But we then match that to the differing methods the DFE use for how they would define the use of a space. We would look at the pupil projections in an area. So what's the current number of pupils that need an education in that area and what's the projection for the future. We'd also look at the net capacity for that school to see what is the base number of workplaces that that school will accommodate by the net capacity calculation, which was produced back in 1997 as part of the sufficiency guidelines. In a secondary school, we would look at the curriculum analysis. So we would look at the usage of the space in terms of the utilisation. So how much of that space is used during the working day. So let's take a simple example of, we have a 25 period 2-week timetable. So we'll assume 50 periods across the 2 weeks. And if that space is used for 40 of those 50 periods, then we've got an 80% utilisation of that space. We'd also look at the school design guidelines. So there's a standardised design for a school now, which is the Building Bulletin 103 designs. And there is a method of calculating the pupil capacity within those guidelines. So we'd match it back to that with area data sheet codes for every space so that you can do the analysis yourself if necessary from the BB 103. In the case of special schools, there is no standardised method of working out the pupil capacity of a special school. The method has always been that the local authority keeps stuffing children in until the school screams and then it's full. But what we do is we reverse engineer the design standards that are in BB 104 to figure out what is the model of that school and what is their requirement for space, and then we match that to what they actually have. So why do we worry about pupil capacity? Well, we've got a graph on screen there of the birth rate since the 1920s through to current, and what you can see is it's constantly changing. So the big thing that we always say, that the trend in pupil capacity is there is no trend. It goes up and down all the while, and you can see the baby booms following the world wars, and you can also see the baby boom from 2000 onwards that we're currently dealing with, and the subsequent fall in the birth rate since 2012. So that's the number of pupils that require educating in this country. But you've also got to take into account the demographic shifts. So over the last 12 months, there's a lot of talk of people moving out of the cities and moving into the more rural towns, and that's going to have a big shift in where those people need an education. So there's also a lot of house building going across the central band of the country, to the Midlands, across Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, and that's creating in itself a massive demand for pupil places. You have other areas of the country that have a very different demographic in that they have quite a transient population where people move into the area on short-term contracts and bring a family with them that needs educating. 12 months later, they might move out and move somewhere else on contract and take those children with them. So that creates a massive problem for how to work out the number of pupil places. And then we add in the recent COVID lockdowns, and what was everybody doing last year? Are we going to get a baby boom following that for those that didn't have Netflix and Sky Movies? So here, what we're showing is the baby boom since 2000 and what that's cost us to generate those pupil places. So 670,000 primary school places created, and so far we've created 373,000 secondary school places, and all of those at a cost of £11.5 billion of capital. So that's a massive amount of money spent on creating those extra places. Now, we've gone back through our own data on the 2,500 schools that we've processed, and we think we've got a pretty good data set of school estates across this country. And from there, we've done quite a detailed piece of work to figure out what is the cost per square metre per year for each space in the school. So this is just the premises cost of that space, and we think it's about £45 per square metre per year for that space. So if you're not using it and you've got spare capacity in your school, that's what you're wasting. So pupil capacity today, who's responsible and how's it managed? Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag really, that you've got head teachers who've traditionally been responsible for the capacity of their school. The local authority, if they needed to talk about additional places, would make an appointment with the head teacher. They'd go along and see them and talk about how they could take some more pupils. Could they take an extra half a form? Do they need them to take a whole extra form? Is it a full increase, or is it just a bulge that they're passing through the school? And it would be the head teacher that would be responsible, working with the local authority. Then we started creating academies who were managed in their own right and had their independence, and then they had the right to decide what was their capacity and how many pupils were they going to take. But you also had the local authority, who were the commissioners of the school places, who needed to make sure there were enough spaces for all the pupils who needed an education in the area. So their problem became quite complex then, because they got to work with many independent academies and then the growing middle tier of the multi-academy trusts to discuss the additional needs. And you throw into that the free schools that were springing up and creating extra places in an area as well. So capacity became an issue that was only really discussed as and when it came to the forefront of somebody's mind, in terms of, do we need more pupil places from the local authority's point of view, or a school wanting to increase its size for other reasons? And it was never really a strategic thing. It was an afterthought that was done as and when. So what would we like to see as a company in the future? Well, what we'd like to see is pupil capacity as an estates function. So the estates manager has a responsibility to provide a facility to the school that they can then use to teach in. So part of that needs to be provision of a space that is to the right size for the number of pupils in the school. We can't ask the head teacher to do that function, because it's what we've always called Boyle's Law for schools. So Boyle's Law being where a gas will expand to fill the available space. A school as an operational unit, when you put it into a building, will also expand to fill the available space. Now, interestingly, Boyle's Law also states that as you contract the space, the pressure increases within the gas, and that also applies. So where a school is very tight for space, there's a lot of pressure on the senior leadership team to be able to deliver the educational outcomes within that space. So it's best to keep it with the estates people, where it can be part of their strategic plan to make sure it matches the pupil place planning projections for an area, and that the modelling has been done on the capacity to say, if we were to look to take these extra pupils, what extra facilities would I need? Could I repurpose existing facilities, or will I need additional space, or have I got too much and I need to perhaps work out which buildings I need to mothball and what I then need to convert to have all the correct facilities for provision of the education. So what we're trying to do is make it a data-driven decision that can be managed at a trust level for a group of schools. So our strategic approach to pupil capacity is in line with the good estates management. So good estates management for schools has a very clear method that it wishes you to go through to make sure that you are looking after your buildings and strategically planning going forward. So what we've done is looked at where our part fits into this, and it's very clear in the land and buildings section that you need to take account of sufficiency of the places within the schools, to know that you've got enough places going forward and that you are taking it as a strategic approach to those places. So from our point of view, we think that the Good Estates Management Guide doesn't go far enough. It talks about having the net capacity, it talks about having the number on roll, but it also talks about it being a strategic issue. And in order for it to be strategic, you've got to look at it in a much more strategic way. You've got to have a lot more data. You've also got to do some modelling and projections. And you also want to do that modelling and projections independently from within your own trust or from within the local authority, so that that data is more valued by all the stakeholders in the pupil places in that area. So those being the local authority, the trust and the parents. So to round off, I'd just like to close off with a little anecdote about a discussion with my 93-year-old dad, who was asking me about what it is that I do day to day and why am I up and down the country in different schools. And I was talking to him about how we work out pupil capacity and how we're specialists in this area and how we've got this massive baby boom and we're trying to figure out how we can educate all these extra kids. And he said, so this is just a bulge, is it, in the population? So yeah, the numbers are shrinking again. Right, so all these places you're creating, you won't need them in a few years' time. No, we won't now. So why don't you do what we did in the war and just share the buildings? What do you mean? Well, when my school got bombed in the war, they closed it because we didn't have the resources and the money to rebuild it. And we just shared the space with the school down the road. So week in, week out, we'd go 6 till 12 and they'd go 12 till 6. And then we'd swap over for the next week and we just shared the building. And then at the end of the war, we just rebuilt the schools. Wouldn't that have worked? Possibly, yeah. Would have only saved 11.5 billion so far, that approach, but never mind. It's just another way of looking at the same problem, and perhaps we should be listening to some of the old folk on how to handle these things strategically. Okay, thank you very much for your time, and if there are any questions, there will be a question and answer session later on, and I'd be happy to discuss any of this in more detail with you.